In my estimation, Iran's principal goal throughout this entire conflict has been to survive, to defeat the attacks against it, to punish American allies and supporters in the region, and to survive. So based on that assessment, I see Iran as holding the strategic initiative, not us. And I think that you've got an almost insoluble problem for us. We are a World War II force structure designed to refight some version of World War II. The last time that happened was Desert Storm in 1991. We should have undergone profound reorganization, reform, and change in the military. We did not. Everybody has worshipped at the altar of Desert Storm ever since, and everybody talks in terms of World War II. Iran is very different. Iran had to make some decisions 20, 25, 30 years ago about what they would and would not do. We know they have effectively no Air Force. We keep talking about having destroyed the Air Force. Well, they have none. Then we talk about destroying the Navy. They had 7 old frigates, but they have a lot of other smaller boats, and they have unmanned systems at sea. That was their answer to the Navy. They appear to have lost the 7 frigates. No one seems to have lost a lot of sleep over that. They were quite old and antiquated, but again, we go back to old metrics. Well, we sank this, we destroyed that, and then we destroyed, we say, some 7,000 targets. Well, that presumes that the targets are meaningful, and that when you run out of quote-unquote meaningful military targets, you have won. Well, there's no evidence for that. Iran, on the other hand, invested heavily in missiles and unmanned systems, drones, and that has paid off handsomely because Iran is a natural fortress. It's a continental power with 93 million people surrounded by mountains and bordered to the south by deserts. How do you invade Iran? Hasn't worked out very well for anybody, certainly not since Alexander the Great. I don't know of anybody that has tried to invade it since the Mongols. And of course, the Mongols were willing to do things that no one else in history would do, including mass murder, at least until we get to the Second World War and then more recently to Gaza. So I think the Iranians hold the strategic initiative. They are capable of holding out much longer. They have been much more successful than we thought they would be. And our efforts have been largely futile. And in the meantime, we blame Iran for closing the Straits of Hormuz. No, that's wrong. Lloyd's of London did that. No one is going to underwrite any shipping until the war is over, or there is a complete cessation of violence. We keep saying, well, Iran stopped this and Iran's caused this. No, it's not true. People in the United States seem to forget Israel began this conflict, and then we joined Israel and got into it. Iran didn't attack us, and Iran didn't attack Israel. So the bottom line is, this is a very strange set of circumstances, and now the ceasefire comes along. And it came along at a very odd time after all these bellicose threats. And the more I look at this, the more persuaded I am, and others, if I look at what evidence we can find out there. I think that the CIA contacted the ISI in Pakistan and said, here's a proposal we'd like your leadership to make. And so they took this proposal, and apparently virtually word for word what we had written, and sent that to the Iranians and then sent it to us, creating the illusion that somehow or another we were approached to do this by Islamabad on behalf of Iran. The Iranians never asked for a ceasefire. There's no evidence for that at all, never. In fact, on Monday, they reiterated their 10 points, and Witkoff said this is a catastrophe. We can't possibly accept any of this. Now, all of a sudden, as part of the ceasefire, we've said we will negotiate, and we will do so on the basis of the 10 points that Iran has submitted. That's a catastrophe if you're an Israeli or an agent of Israel. So I don't know how that's going to turn out. And then we discover that Witkoff and Kushner are going to go back to Islamabad and theoretically represent the United States, when everybody has concluded they're Israeli agents and they represent exclusively the interests of Israel. Nobody wants them anymore for that very reason. Now, this is not new. When Tony Blinken was the Secretary of State, the Egyptians and others in the region all concluded he was an agent for Israel. They didn't see him as representing us either. So I don't know what to make of any of it, but I have very low expectations. And I don't think this is going to fundamentally change a great deal. And as far as I can tell, the military buildup on our side continues.
Right. Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. I studied today what the Iranians put out in the Iranian media, their version of what's happening, translating it, and they're saying that they achieved almost all of their goals, and that by now there are the proposal. The Americans had been begging for a month, for 30 days, they're saying, for negotiations, and now they've been putting forward a proposal of the Iranian 10 points. So they are willing to consider this, but they will do so under complete distrust. Literally they said literally with our finger on the trigger. So if the other side does something foolish, then well, we just continue, because I think their assessment is the same as yours. They have the strategic advantage at the moment, because what they need to do is to hold out, and they do, and they try to establish reciprocity, right? For everything that hurts them, they have a designated target and a designated strategy to hurt the other side as well. And they're willing to do that, but they're also willing to inverse Clausewitz, war, the continuation of the politics by other means, politics, the continuation of war by other means, right? To try again in Islamabad through negotiations. Do you think that if this ceasefire doesn't hold, that overall the United States will hurt? Because we can see that certain of the things that Iran was able to do over the last 1 week, 10 days, especially the shooting down of U.S. Air Forces like airplanes and helicopters, Tomahawks. Black Hawks. What do you make out of that? That the Iranians keep that capacity despite all of the pronouncements by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump that basically it's open skies in Iran?
Well, I've seen some reports by people recently in Iran. These were provided through intermediaries, through journalists. The people that were reporting are not American nationals, but they are also not from the region. They look like they may be Europeans who, for whatever reason, were able to enter Iran. There are also some reports from Asians. They tend to say the same thing. They estimate that Iran has at least 15,000 missiles remaining in its arsenal, maybe more, and at least 45,000 unmanned systems drones. And their manufacturing capacity for drones is untouched. And the missile arsenal is untouched for all intents and purposes. And they have more than enough launchers, mobile launchers. They seem to have lost, we think, perhaps 50% of their mobile launchers, but those seem to be replaceable, and they still have half of them left. So I think from the standpoint of their offensive striking power, that seems to be in place. So that's the first thing. I think it's important for us to know that, because that's a lot of missiles. And of course, all of this is underground, and you look at these underground facilities, there are lots of pictures that are being shown online. These things are enormous. This reflects a 20-year effort on the part of the Iranians to build these underground facilities. So we have to juxtapose that with ourselves. We're operating 6,000 miles away from the United States, at least that far. We use Germany and other European states as intermediate stations, but bottom line is that we don't have access to ports right in the region, which means we go all the way south to Diego Garcia, and in the Mediterranean we can go up. At least to this point, we've done it to Greece and other places. So we're at the end of a very long line. Our manufacturing capacity is not the same. We could produce perhaps 7, 8, 9 missiles every couple of days. Some people say perhaps 10 a week. I'm not sure. but we have never built a quote-unquote surge capacity. And when you look at what the Russians have done, when they rapidly ramped up, they created a surge capacity such that if the battlefield demands it, they can point to a particular piece of equipment and say, we need more of it immediately. And it can go from, instead of 10 up to 1,000. The Chinese are supporting them. We know the Chinese can manufacture roughly 10,000 rocket motors, that is rockets or missiles, 1,000 rocket motors or missiles a day. We'd be lucky to produce 100 in a week. When you look at these kinds of things and you realize the Chinese and the Russians are strongly supporting the Iranians because they have no interest in seeing the Iranian state destroyed by us under any circumstances, you see that if anybody needed this ceasefire, we did.
Right.
I'm not saying it was irrelevant to the Iranians, and I'm sure they're grateful for it, but we needed it. But it's temporary. And everybody that's looked at this, it's sober-minded, American, European, Iranian, doesn't make any difference, has all said, everyone has said the same thing. This looks temporary. This does not look like a permanent solution. Now, if they send Witkoff and Kushner back to Islamabad, the two gentlemen that the foreign minister previously said, please don't send them back. There's no point. And since you've been attacked twice while you're in the midst of negotiations, the government in Iran doesn't harbor any illusions. Now, the population may. And here in the United States, people are all celebrating. Say, oh, see, we crushed those people. And, of course, that's not true. But that's what people think.
Yeah, but the Iranians proved for all intents and purposes that while their leadership are mortal man, their system carries on. I mean, they just replenish, right? I mean, the Ayatollah is dead, long live the Ayatollah, like pretty much literally. So, I mean, it just keeps going on. In a sense, didn't that advantage that the system is so resilient actually maybe lead to some sort of reassessment in Washington of what is possible and what not in terms of not just regime change, but achieving any kind of meaningful goals. Plus, what do you make out of these threats yesterday by Donald Trump? Basically, I mean, all of us, we were guessing that he's now thinking out loud about nuking Iran for real.
I don't think the nuclear weapon will be used by us. I just don't. I could be wrong, but my perception is there are too many sober-minded people in Washington to allow that to happen. They understand you're opening Pandora's box. You're normalizing the use of something that's very dangerous that could then be turned against us and other countries. On the other hand, I know that we do have a number of capabilities on the conventional side that we haven't employed yet, but they're not war-winning. That's what people need to understand. They can do an enormous amount of damage at some point, but they're not going to end the war. And I think your point is valid. The Iranians have demonstrated conclusively they cannot be defeated. It reminds me of the negotiations at Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Radek, who was the principal representative until Trotsky was sent in to relieve him, sent back these messages to Lenin. This is difficult, but the Germans realized that we cannot be conquered. And they were right. Imperial Germany understood Russia. It's huge. It's enormous. We can't possibly conquer it. We're not even going to try. And if you look at the lines at the end of the war, they were in eastern Poland and around the Baltic states and so forth, and what we today call Moldova. They didn't go any further. Well, I think we have realized that Iran cannot be conquered. I think that's clear. So if you can't conquer it and you can't get regime change, your best hope is to destroy it,
right,
and cause society to collapse and hopefully wrest control away from Iran of their oil fields. That's it. That's the best that we can do. And I don't think the rest of the world supports that. But Israel does.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the real core problem. And this is what most Americans are missing entirely. Why are we doing this? What particular reason is there for us out of the blue to expend all of this time, money, and resources on Iran's destruction? There isn't. There is just nothing strategically to justify it. We're doing it because this is what Israel and its lobby in the United States and the people that back it want. And they happen to own the two houses, the Senate and the House, and they own the White House. And all the key players and advisors who are driving this around Trump, they're effectively agents of the Israel lobby, supporters of. You go to someone like Hegseth, I mean, this is a fanatical Zionist Christian, or Christian Zionist, whatever you want to call it. But he's 100% aligned with what Mr. Netanyahu wants. The question has always been, both in Israel and in the United States, is how far is Donald Trump willing to go? And Trump was not willing to attack at the time that we joined the war. Israel had to start it. They started the war, and we were sort of grudgingly dragged into it. I still don't think Trump has his heart in this. I've never believed that he does. And he tries to compensate with lots of bellicose rhetoric, which is what you heard when he threatened the destruction of everything a few days ago. But now he's in a trap of his own making. He's caught up in this escalatory trap. And if you look at the 10 points, I mean, how can we possibly accept that unless we are prepared to divorce ourselves from Israel? Because that's what happens.
The most important demand probably is that the United States completely withdraws from the region, like no more bases, no more stationing, no more airfields, and so on. How realistic is that? But not in terms of what the United States wants, but what it still has at the moment. Because actually, Iran attacked a lot of these places, right? The radar stations are gone. A lot of the bases have been attacked. We have reports that thousands of U.S. Personnel were moved out of the region. What do we know about how much U.S. presence there still is in this ring of fire that the U.S. build up around Iran?
Well, we've looked at 27 bases that have been under serious attack by the Iranians, and they are largely unusable. Everything of any real value has been destroyed. Most of the soldiers who were present there, airmen or sailors or Marines, have been withdrawn. Because to leave them there, of course, was to leave them vulnerable to destruction. Now, there still are some in the areas, I'm told. They've moved into local housing areas, into some large-scale hotels, hiding out in the basement or something. But you're hitting on something that's very important. First of all, most Americans didn't even know that we had all of these bases. Secondly, the reason those bases were there is because we promised the Gulf states, the GCC, Kuwait, and so forth, that we would protect them. We've now demonstrated that we can't. Warfare has changed. We cannot stop all these missiles from getting through. They bought heavily into our air defense capability. It's had some success, but not as much as they thought it would. So the real question, the third question is, do they really want us to come back? Now, the elites, most of them, these are the very wealthy elites, the ruling elites, which frankly, inside the Arab world, are viewed as kind of an extended Epstein class, corrupt, despicable, decayed. They're in Egypt. Some are in Switzerland. Some are in London. Some are in Paris. But they're not living right now in these places. And large numbers of other people have gotten into their cars or trucks or whatever they had, and as I understand it, driven to Riyadh, because from Riyadh you can fly to the Sinai, down at the bottom there. I've forgotten the name of the resort, and from there you can fly to Cairo, and you can either stay in Egypt or fly somewhere else. So I think the real question is, how do we just quietly admit that we can't stay and do much? And how did the elites react to that? Because when I went into the Pentagon during the last sort of 60 to 90 days of the Trump administration, and I began asking, because at the time, Donald Trump wanted to find a way to withdraw our forces from Iraq and Syria, not just Afghanistan. And when I kept pushing people, I said, what do we have this base near Al-Tanf for in Syria? And the answer was, for Israel. I said, well, Israel has better intelligence on the region than we do. How can we provide early warning? No. You have to understand, we're there for Israel. And I think the view from Israel and the view from their supporters in Washington is we're in the Gulf for Israel. The question is, can we stay there anymore? I don't think we can. And I think the proverbial handwriting is on the wall. But how does Donald Trump declare victory, look like he's in charge, and do that? So I suspect we may end up with something similar to the end of the 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy told the Russians, look, you want us to pull our missiles out of Turkey, we'll do that. But we can't do it immediately because that would upset the political structure and stability here in Washington. They'll say, well, we surrendered. And said, we're not surrendering, but we agree with you. We'll pull our missiles out if you pull those out of Cuba. Khrushchev accommodated us. He pulled his missiles out, and once that had been accomplished, some months later, we quietly withdrew all the missiles from Turkey. So you may see something like that eventually. But Americans must understand that the sticking point is Israel. We have said, number one, no uranium enrichment, because that's what Israel wants. We've said, you've got to dismantle most of your, theater ballistic missile arsenal, because that's what Israel demands. And, you can't cooperate with anyone in the region that is your quote-unquote partner or ally, because that's what Israel wants. And in addition to this, Israel wants greater Israel. The Israelis have already said, you can have your ceasefire with Iran. Okay, we'll pause for 2 weeks, but we're going to continue to attack Lebanon. Iran has said that's unacceptable. That means an inevitable resumption of the conflict. So we're backing the Greater Israel Project. And if you look at the map, that's very destabilizing to the region. You're turning over half of Syria, or a quarter of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Sinai, and part of the Nile Valley to Israel. I don't think that's going to happen.
Why? I mean, there are the most important, I think, voice online that says that this is not what's actually happening is a man called Brian Berletic. And he keeps making the point that no, it's not the tail wagging the dog, it's the dog pretending that the tail has undue influence on it in order to basically, conveniently then blame it all on the tail, right? When in fact this is a long-term strategy by the United States, by the neocon faction, the road to Persia and so on, these strategies to just grind down and destroy all and every opposition to the US influence in all corners of the world, actually. What do you make out of that argument?
He's never spent any time in Washington, because if he'd spent any time on the Hill, he would note that there is an Israeli representative, an agent of Israeli influence and power, a so-called member of the Israeli lobby in practically every congressional office and senatorial office. He's there for a reason, to ensure that whatever those senators and congressmen do is aligned with what Israel wants, and they are in a position to turn off the money spigot. The way it works is, if you don't support what Israel wants on this bill or this piece of legislation or in this policy, that's fine. We will simply turn all the money we would have given to you for your reelection over to your opponent, because they're effectively agnostic about whether you are a so-called Republican or Democrat. The only thing they care about is, will you support what we want? That's a lot of money. And where does the money come from? It comes from the Zionist billionaires inside the United States. So he's dead wrong. You've got to go all the way back to the 1990s and look at the authors of a document on strategy. It was Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl. I mean, just go down the list. These were all Zionists. And what they wanted to do, this was their argument: we need to gain control of all the oil resources in the Middle East, and then we will have China by the throat. That was the argument, because the Chinese are dependent upon the oil. Well, 50% of Chinese oil comes from the Gulf, 13% from Iran, but the rest of it comes from the other Gulf states. Is China concerned about the destruction of oil infrastructure in the Gulf? Absolutely. But China's not going to go to war over it. And the Chinese can go to other sources, which they're doing right now. There are other places. Mexico can provide a lot of oil. There are plenty of places to go. It's not going to make life easy, but it can be done. But I heard Brian's argument, and I happen to think very highly of Brian, particularly his assessment on the tactical level. He was one of the first people to recognize how profoundly things were changing on the battlefield. And I think he understood better than most Putin's deliberate and methodical approach to war. Most people mistook that as evidence for weakness, that and it never was. It still isn't. But on this point, I think he's dead wrong. The man who is calling the tune is Mr. Netanyahu, not Mr. Trump.
So how do you assess the situation for Israel then? Because, like, to be honest, one thing, I'm on a little vacation right now for 1 week in Southeast Asia, and I'm in a lovely little resort. And one thing here that really struck me is the number of Israeli tourists. I just didn't think that they would be able to come here, because actually what the resort tells us is that a lot of people had to cancel their flights, but most of them are from Europe, the ones who can't fly through Qatar and Doha anymore. But there's a lot of Israeli tourists who are obviously able to make it over here. So because I believe that Israel too is being hammered at the moment, but it seems that they're able to carry on at the moment, aren't they?
Well, it depends on the individual Israeli and how much money and influence they have. Mr. Netanyahu's son, who would otherwise be in the Israeli Defense Force, is in Miami.
Right.
Gee, what's he doing in Miami? He's at the right age to serve in the armed forces. Lots of Israelis have disappeared and reappeared in Cyprus, where Israeli money is pouring in to buy up vast tracts of real estate. They are buying up locations on Greek islands, and they are in Greece, and they are also in Serbia. So I think you've got large numbers of Israelis who have money and influence who've managed to get out. Now, the Israeli military has taken over many of the airfields, many of the places from which people could depart. And of course, Ben Gurion was heavily bombed, so Ben Gurion's not in good shape. I don't know if they're flying out of there at the moment. Perhaps they are. But the point is that the Israeli military was stopping people from leaving the country. I don't know how many Israelis, when you say Israelis, you've got to be careful, because 2 million people living in Israel out of the 9 million are Arabs. In other words, Palestinians living on land inside Israel. I don't know how many Jews are left in Israel. And I'm sure that the Hasidic Jews, the Jews in Jerusalem that are really very different from everybody else, I'm sure they're where they are. But the rest of the Jewish population, I just don't know what's left. And now you have an Israeli Defense Force on the ground, the army. It's demoralized, it's exhausted, it's worn out. They're having trouble getting anybody to come into it and fight. They want more reserves. They're trying to mobilize, and people have said, no, I'm not going. I think your point is well taken, but I think the situation inside Israel and for the Israeli state and society is very, very serious.
Right, and I must maybe make the point that the only way that I have to assess this is, of course, by listening to white people speaking Hebrew, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are Israelis. But still, I mean, I don't know anyone else who would do that. But so overall, we simply don't know how large the level of destruction also is in Israel, do we? Because of the also kind of the blockade, that the news blockade from over there. So do you think that Israel actually had a hand in the ceasefire agreement, or that Israel is actually seriously mad at Donald Trump for kind of doing this outreach to the Pakistanis in order to signal to the Iranians that now, after 40 days, would be the time to maybe have a break?
No, that's exactly my perception. Everything I'm seeing is that the Israelis are furious. He did this apparently without necessarily consulting them, or if he did consult them, it was in the form of, this is what I'm going to do. And that's why Mr. Netanyahu has finally come around and said, all right, we'll respect the ceasefire with Iran that you reached for 2 weeks. But we are not stopping anything we're doing in southern Lebanon or in Lebanon, period. Now they're attacking Beirut again. So I think they're unhappy. And that's why I find it interesting that Kushner and Witkoff will go back, because as I said on Monday, Witkoff said anything that these Iranians want, these 10 points are outrageous. We can't accept it. We don't want it. And that was one of the concessions that Trump made to get at the ceasefire. Well, we'll take your 10 points as the basis for future negotiations. We didn't say you could have the ceasefire if you do it on the basis of our 15 points, which amount to unconditional surrender of Iran. So I'm sure the Israelis, in fact, I know the Israelis are not happy about it. But it's only 2 weeks, and I think the Israelis are well aware at the end of 2 weeks this thing will resume.
But what kind of, why would the United States want a 2-week break? I mean, if there's a country on earth that can just continue doing this for another 2 weeks, it will be the United States. What does a ceasefire buy the US that it cannot get without a ceasefire?
Well, let's look at the larger picture. I think the reality has struck home with President Trump. It may not have reached everyone in Washington, but I think President Trump understands this. The world is going to face famine in the coming months in places like the Middle East and Africa and elsewhere, and India, because of the fertilizer deficit. And the Russians, who produce much of the fertilizer, we do as well. If you put us all together, we can't compensate for the deficit. That's how severe it is. You have to look at the plastics industries that are shutting down. You have to look at the microcircuitry industries, particularly the wonderful plant we talk about all the time in Taiwan, along with the operations in Korea and Japan, because they're not getting any helium. There are a whole series of products. The last count were 47 products essential to our civilization's daily life that are now unavailable because the absence of petroleum and all the byproducts, sulfur, everything that you can think of. And I think he knows that. And I think he knows also that the global South is headed in not to a recession, into depression. The global South has no reserves of strategic petroleum. In most cases, they don't have the means to refine or convert any of it. Australia is a perfect example. They don't have any refineries operating, none. They're in a lot of trouble. When this information finally hits the president's desk, and this is not something that he considered seriously, because remember, I think the Israelis told him this will be over in 4 or 5 days. You know, they can't withstand this. We'll kill the top leadership. We'll force the regime to topple. So let's just go do this. And grudgingly, he went along with it. It reminds me of what Bill Clinton was told back in January of 1999, when he was asked how long will this air campaign last? And he was told, well, sir, perhaps 3 or 4 days, maybe a week or 10 days, 2 weeks at the most. And so Bill Clinton said, okay, then go ahead. It was 78 days.
Yeah.
And the air campaign didn't end it. It ended because of negotiations in Moscow between Strobe Talbot, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the leadership, Yeltsin and his advisors. And we bribed them. We promised them all sorts of things, including lots of money, and they pulled the plug on the Serbs. And the Serbs had always said from the very beginning, if we don't have access to Russian energy and Russian food, then we probably are not going to make it through the Balkan winter. We'll have hundreds of thousands of people starve and freeze to death. So when that became clear, that's when Milosevic said, we have to withdraw from Kosovo. We don't want to, but without Russian support, we can't stay. I think we're going to have an end to this particular tragedy along the same lines, for reasons of global economic distress, and also because we're sliding into a very serious recession now, Pascal, that nobody wants to admit. Every time they publish good news about jobs reports, a month later it's all adjusted downward. The truth is, we're in a very fragile position, and it could very, very rapidly degenerate into one of these affairs where the interest rates rise, the yield on our bonds rise, we can't service the debt, the whole thing collapses. I think all of this has come together in the White House in some sort of understanding. And I think privately, if President Trump could speak truthfully, having worked for the man briefly and talked to him a couple of times, because I liked him personally. This is not an unpleasant person by any means. I think he probably says, well, let's hope this 2-week ceasefire can be extended and extended and extended, because he knows these other factors are important and inescapable.
So, there were a lot of people who were worried that these religious fanatics in the White House seriously got to him. XF being one of them, of course. But we know that Rubio harbors similar ideas, and of course that White House faith bureau that they're having now with this blonde lady, I forgot her name, the crazy pastor, who are permanently stationed at the White House, and they do prayer sessions with him, around him, and calling him like a vessel of God and whatnot. You think that he didn't buy into it because a lot of his rhetoric in the last 2 weeks was extremely worrisome that he might actually, he might have just gone down that route.
I think that President Trump is not a religious fanatic. He simply isn't. I think that he welcomes anybody to the Oval Office who will worship at the altar of Donald Trump.
Right.
Let's face it, that's the way it is. It's sort of like the Israel lobby. The only way you can become a member and a supporter is to worship at the altar of Israel. Then you can join the Israel lobby. If you don't do that, well, then you're an anti-Semite. It's kind of a dichotomy like that with Trump. I think this religious fanaticism is real. We have always had that strain in our society. I mean, we can go back to the Puritans that left the Netherlands and came to the United States, and they were very much, in that sense, fanatical. They were by no means moderate people. When Sigmund Freud visited the United States after World War I in the 1920s, when he left, they said, well, what can you tell us about the United States? He said, the place is a theocracy. Because he saw the tremendous power and influence that was exploited and exerted over the government by Protestant pastors who were, extreme. That's how we ended up with the prohibition. Now, it's a sine curve. It goes up and down. I think more people in the United States are horrified by this radical Zionism that's linked to this radical form of Christianity than are supporting it. Because all you have to do is look at the polls. Where is President Trump in the polls? He's now in the mid to low 30s. If it gets down into the mid to low 20s, he won't last in office. He'll be removed. That's how serious it is.
Right. I mean, that threat looms over the horizon, and also, of course, the midterms in November. That might have been on his mind, thinking that he must somehow get out of this now. But maybe instead of talking about this for the last 5-6 minutes, I'm wondering about your assessment of Europe. I mean, that weird continent that had nothing to do now with any kind of these negotiations, that kind of went along with everything, maybe with the exception of Spain. And what's your assessment of where they are now? Because okay, you've got this unfinished war in Iran, you've got the unfinished war in Ukraine, and they are militarizing at the moment, but doing so from a real position of very severe weakness.
Well, I lived in Europe for almost 10 years in total. And I've loved Europe all my life. I always, when I got to shape headquarters, one of the questions I was asked is, what do you think about NATO? And I said, well, if Western civilization is purest at its source, then this place is the fountainhead of our civilization. I mean, that's how important I regard Europe. However, I also very quickly concluded that Europe would be much better off without us than with us. And I was one of these people that said, we've got to find a way to disengage from Europe. And when I asked somebody, in the absence of the Soviet threat, what holds this NATO alliance together? Because everybody, at least when I was there, was very defensively oriented. No one thought in terms of waging war offensively against anyone. And they said, well, in the absence of the Soviet Union, I guess the French are the only natural enemy of everyone in Europe. Of course, I laughed. And I certainly don't view it that way, but that was a commonly repeated phrase. I think the Europeans right now, what should have happened is that we should have said, look, we'll stay in NATO, but we're withdrawing our forces.
Right.
And you are going to have to provide the senior general to command. We will no longer command everything in NATO as an American. We'll support you, but you've got to take responsibility from a strictly European standpoint for the military alliance, because they already have as the NATO, whatever it is, what do they call it, the Secretary General, who is a European on rotation. We didn't do that. That would have been a nice, gradual, slow, predictable disengagement. And instead, President Trump, who sometimes sounds like a petulant child, hurls abuse at anybody that disagrees with him or won't do what he says. And I think that's what's been going on with the Europeans off and on. He seems to think that NATO is an alliance of vassals who are obligated to their master to respond to whatever the master says or does. And unfortunately, if you go back and look at the interventions that we've been part of in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Libya, and now what we're doing, there is this expectation, well, if we decide to attack someone, you're obligated to come with us. He doesn't understand that's truly alien to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But the Europeans themselves have done that, because if you ask them, whether they're Poles or Germans or something else, they'll say, well, we want good relations with Washington, so if we have to provide something, we'll do it rather than not. I hope they've wakened up to reality, and I hope they will take responsibility for themselves. But I don't see any evidence that that will happen until all the governments in Europe are gone. Because the people leading European states right now are doing as much damage, maybe more damage than Adolf Hitler did to Europe when he was in power. And that began with Merkel in 2015, and it's continued without interruption. It's been catastrophic. It's catastrophic, especially for the Germans, the French, the Dutch, even the Scandinavians. It's all got to stop. And I think the destruction of cheap energy is going to help enormously, because that's going to drive the people in office out eventually. Then we'll see Europe reassert itself. Not necessarily as one entity, because you see, NATO is too large.
Right.
The view strategically from Rome or Belgrade or, Ljubljana or Zagreb is very different from the strategic view from Stockholm or London or Paris. That's the problem.
So you don't view NATO necessarily as a tool of the United States to wield power over its vassals. That's not how you see it.
Oh no, I'm very opposed to that. And unfortunately, I think this is what's alienating Europeans. They're finally beginning to wake up.
Right, but does it have that kind of character, and that's something that should be changed, or do you think it never had that character? That's a misinterpretation of what NATO is.
No. In fact, I went to a conference, and this is back in 2000, shortly after I left my position at the Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe. And somebody said, well, describe for us America's relationship with Europe. I said, think of it this way. What was Rome's relationship with the Greek city-states? Rome always admired everything that was Hellenic. Anything that originated in Greece was viewed as inherently superior. All educated Romans learned to read, write, and speak Greek. But the Greeks were told to shut up, get in line, and behave as members of the Roman Empire. And they had to provide at least one legion fully equipped for use by the Romans. Well, that was the relationship that I saw when I left SHAPE. At the end of the day, the American four-star would sit there and say, well, these people ultimately have to do whatever the hell we tell them, so to hell with them. Go be nice to them. And I was always very polite. And the British deputy tried to be very polite, but the American four-star was right. They were stuck. Either you do it, or the hell with you. You get cut out. Nobody wanted to be cut out. So I'm hopeful that changes in the future.
Right. Even Switzerland has having this really bizarre experience that they've been paying now for months or for years for a Patriot system that is not being delivered. And now they said we're not paying for this anymore. And now they found out that the Americans are just diverting the payments that they're making for F-35s that are not being delivered For those, it's like, everybody's like, "What do we do? What do we do? Oh, we don't know. It's bizarre. It's utterly bizarre.
Well, the funny thing is that Switzerland was always hauled out as the example down in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which I thought was hysterical. Because here you would sit. I was there in 1995. You sit with the Serbs, the Croats, and then the Bosniaks. These people had just been killing each other for a long time. There was an enormous amount of blood spilled. And the representative from Washington says, "We think Switzerland is a good model for you." Oh, really? You know, there was no sense. Well, Switzerland is very different from Bosnia-Herzegovina. Switzerland came into existence as an entity because the people that lived within those mountain ranges wanted it. They had a different cultural outlook, a different way of thinking. You can't apply Switzerland to Bosnia-Herzegovina. But it's just interesting that sort of thing with an American who, by the way, knew nothing about Switzerland, didn't speak French or German, didn't know anything about, the people living in the former Yugoslavia. This is a big problem for us. We just don't know what we're talking about when we talk about other people. And this, of course, is what is being said over and over and over again. We miscalculated about Iran. We didn't understand Iran. I mean, the average American said, "Oh, these are just more of the same and as Iraq and elsewhere. We'll just crush these people." Wait a minute. This is a core civilizational state. This is a 2,700-year-old empire, nation. Well, they have different kinds of people. We can stir up trouble between them. And I thought, well, wait a minute. A lot of these people lived within the confines of the Persian Empire for very, very many centuries and are quite comfortable doing so. They have a role to play. I mean, none of this was considered.
No, but it is now being more or less exposed as a reality, including the fact that the largest non-Israeli Jewish community in the region is living in Iran, and that Israel has been blowing up yesterday or the day before yesterday one of their synagogues. It's like it's really it kind of gives a moment of clarity, I think, about what this entire enterprise is about.
Well, here's another data point for you. Someone showed me the map of Tehran and who had lived there and drew lines around certain neighborhoods and said, these are the neighborhoods that we would call in the United States as middle class or upper middle class. The people there are well educated, and most of them are advocates for a secular society.
Right.
It's not that they hate the government. They just want the government to recognize the criticality of becoming increasingly secular. He said, here's the rest of the story. We killed most of those people. Those neighborhoods have been leveled. So all of this nonsense that comes out of the administration, we want the Iranian people to be free. That's all crap.
Of course.
It's meaningless crap.
Of course. It's the media story. But yeah, we'll have to see how that plays out. Colonel, thank you so much for your assessment. It's always very valuable to hear how you look at this. People want to read or know more about your analysis. Where should they go?
Well, a couple of places. The first and most important right now is I now have a Substack. It's called McGregor Warrior Substack. By all means, go there. I've been writing one essay a week. I've stopped publishing anywhere else. And it's posted on my Substack, and I think people will find the information there useful. I've also republished a lot of things that have been written over the year, particularly about the criticality of reforming, reorganizing the U.S. military establishment for a different world. And I hope that emerges as a principal goal after this war ends. Because if ever you wanted an example of a lot that's wrong with us and the way we do business, just look at this air and missile campaign. We got to get out of this business of thinking that every solution is somehow or another a function of air power and missiles. It's not.